welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. This is our mini-episode where I will hone in on some of the finer points from last week's main episode. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today I'll be continuing our discussion on the 1962 film Hell is for Heroes. Hell is for Heroes focuses on a small, depleted squad of soldiers in the 95th Infantry Division situated on the Siegfried Line near the Moselle River in late 1944. The squad is ordered to hold a section of the front line meant for a much larger unit and are thinly spread in front of ominous German concrete bunkers. Fully aware of their precarious position, the squad goes to great lengths to fool the Germans as to their actual numbers and deter any enemy attacks. Hell is for Heroes stars Steve McQueen as Private Reese, Bobby Darin as Private Corby, James Coburn as Henshaw, Bob Newhart, Fess Parker, and many others. The film was directed by Don Siegel, produced by Henry Blank, and written by Richard Carr and Robert Peroche. The production was hampered throughout by infighting amongst the cast and director, as well as a low budget. Despite this, the film was and still is critically well thought of.
And in front of them, they would put their mines, and then they put wire over the mines, and all the lanes, the fire lanes in there were prepared for their fire. They had a mine that if you stepped on it, it would jump, and then it explode. They had booby traps all over the place. It was, and of course they had them so that they would protect each other when it wasn't fortification to another fortification with their fire. And you, of course, all you got is a rifle and a hand grenade. We couldn't even use our artillery in there because the force is so thick. The artillery forward observer man couldn't see more than 10 yards in front of him. So he'd have to fire by sound more than anything else.
That was the voice of David Roderick, talking about how German pillboxes and fortifications were laid out on the Siegfried Line. Roderick was a platoon sergeant in the 4th Infantry Division and ran into the fortifications of the Siegfried Line in many locations during his campaign through Western Europe. We'll hear more from Dave in just a bit. This movie is placed in a location in which many movies about the Western Front are not, for some reason. The location, of course, being the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line was a line of fortifications that the U.S. Army knew about and was prepared to breach, but still offered substantial resistance to the American and British incursion attempts. The combat sections of Hell is for Heroes are pretty accurate when it comes to the general actions in and around the Siegfried Line. Now a bit of history on the Siegfried Line, or the Westwall, as the Germans called it. The Westwall was supposed to be a last bastion of sorts on the Western Front of the Reich. And by Reich, I'm talking about Germany itself, of course. Construction on the Westwall began in 1936. The line of fortifications eventually stretched the length of the German border, from the Dutch border all the way to Switzerland. Like the French Maginot Line, the West Wall was a throwback, if you will, to the days of World War I, where fixed fortifications and trench systems would offer the main line of defense. In the U.S. Army, we called it the MLR, the MLR, of course, being the main line of resistance. The MLR along the West Wall would be concrete emplacements, and specifically concrete pillboxes with walls and ceilings up to 8 feet thick, and some emplacements. I just have to throw in a plug here for the German intensive use of concrete. These guys were masters in the art of cement. Just look at the Atlantic Wall and the Siegfried Line. Concrete, literally, for thousands of miles. Anyway, the pillboxes or bunkers along the line were either standalone or interconnected. Those interconnected were done so with trench systems or sometimes underground tunnels. Fields of fire were chosen so that they would be interlocking. Pre-registered artillery locations were painted on the inside of the viewing apertures of the pillboxes so that the defenders could quickly call to a pre-registered location for artillery support. Aside from the pillboxes and artillery, were what the Siegfried Line is probably best known for, and these little things became known as dragon's teeth. These little things were concrete pyramids about 3 to 4 feet tall that were designed to impede both infantry and armor. Tanks could not pass over the dragon's teeth, and infantry could, albeit at a slower pace than on a straight run. Between the dragon's teeth, pillboxes, and artillery, the line was fierce. In some locations, as many as 15 bunkers could be found in 1 square kilometer. It was a beautifully laid plan of defense, and by 1939, when it had been completed, was touted by Nazi propaganda as being an impregnable wall that would protect the fatherland from any ground attack from the West. By the end of 1943 and early 1944, however, the West Wall was hardly a wall at all, a shell of its former self. A great many of the fortifications lay abandoned with vital parts ransacked for use in constructing the Atlantic Wall. Many bunkers had been turned into farmers' sheds, storing farming equipment and crops. The OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, knew this in 1944 and, as such, ordered a system of people's labor to restore the line. People's labor would have been the BDM, the League of German Girls, and the Hitler Youth, as well as forced labor. And restore it they did. Festooned with artillery, most of which was captured on the Eastern Front, although it didn't really matter, they still fired. Machine guns and landmines galore. The line was a significant obstacle in the way of Americans heading to Germany in 1944. By mid-September 44, over 160,000 German defenders lay in those concrete pillboxes, waiting on their enemy to show themselves. 2 full American armies probed the Siegfried Line in September, attempting to find a weak spot. There weren't any to be found at all. Early American incursions into or through the incredibly few weak spots almost immediately resulted in a withering German counterattack. An attack in the northern Ardennes area by the 28th Infantry Division resulted in modest success in that several pillboxes were captured, as well as about 50 prisoners. However, within an hour of the end of the 28th assault, a counteroffensive hit them that resulted in over 1,000 American casualties. Ordinary artillery barrages did little to the fortifications except rattle the fillings of the inhabitants of the pillboxes. Flamethrowers worked well if you could get close enough to the pillboxes. Tanks helped, but more often than not, they would be knocked out by enemy artillery or anti-tank fire. In the 1st Army sector, the veteran 4th Infantry Division stood ready to try their luck against the Siegfried Line. Fresh from the push across France, where the 4th Infantry Division's casualties were enormous, the unit, while veteran from Normandy, was a shell of itself. More new replacements filled the ranks than did actual combat veterans. One of the veterans, who was still able to stand on his own 2 feet and had no holes in his body, was a young forward artillery observer named James Flanagan. He was one of the old hands in the 8th Regiment, seemingly always at the front lines, even though he wasn't infantry. He was there with the grunts, calling in artillery support right with them. Flanagan was loved by the grunts up front. He provided them the help they needed, and they knew he was no joke. In the following oral history clip, we'll hear from James Flanagan about how the pillboxes of the Siegfried Line were knocked out, and how he, as a forward artillery observer, helped to push the Ivy Division through the defenses of the West Wall.
Most of it was hilly country, not mountains, hilly country. And pillboxes covered each other. Some were on top of a hill, some were on the side, You had to take one of the pillboxes out because the other one covered it. And if you could get one out, then you could get around the other one. And sometimes you get lucky, you could take 3 of them out in a day. Flamethrower. Sometimes they would get out and try and get away or whatever. They knew, we were going to take it anyway. When that happened, we'd fire time fire, which is great because it goes off 25 or 30 feet up, and it's great stuff. And on personnel, oh boy, I would have hated the men under it. Bad. How do you say war is hell? You didn't know them, and they didn't know you, but you're trying to kill them. It's not nice. Not nice at all. And and you're thinking of how you can take out more of them. Not nice. Not nice at all.
Another member of the Ivy Division, one of the lucky ones who made it out of Normandy only to find himself staring at the Siegfried Line, was the man we heard from earlier, Sergeant David Roderick. Roderick was a platoon sergeant in the fall of 1944, and in the next clip describes how, with the help of Army Air Forces, artillery, and tanks, the 4th and units like them were able to crack the line over and over again.
But the rest of us went across then on the 11th of September right into Germany. And of course we confronted then the Siegfried Line, and that was tough. And we learned to take care of those fortifications pretty fast. We'd bring in the Air Force, get our artillery down, make the Germans huddle down in there. Then, as I said before, then we'd get a tank destroyer in there and get him behind, stick his what we call a whump gun, which is a 90 millimeter, and let him blast off, and they would come out. But and so we cracked the Siegfried Line pretty quick. And matter of fact, we did such a good job, they pulled us out 3 times, and we cracked it 3 other places for different outfits. So counting Hurricane, which we actually cracked it again, we cracked the Siegfried Line 4 times. The Siegfried Line was these big concrete tank obstructions, and then they had the masks fortification like they did on the beach, but they make them look like a barn or like a house, you know. And but they would be out in the open. A lot of them were out in the open, but most of them were at the edge of the forest. And one town, matter of fact, Branscheid, was practically nothing but fortifications. They just looked like houses, you know. And that was a tough one. That was a tough one to take. But at this point, we're running out of gas. We're running out of ammunition. You know, we've been fighting for months, and in Europe, the practice was when they put an infantry unit in there in the line, you stayed. So I haven't had any rest now since the 3 days after Cherbourg fall. That was it. We just stayed in the line, and you just got replacements. They just sent you replacements all the time, and so it was getting to be winter, cold, and by October, why we were living in those things, and making just patrols, making contact with the Germans and finding out where they were, who they were, and so forth. Wasn't much fighting going on. A lot of patrolling going on.
While Flanagan and Roderick and their 4th Division mates knocked out pillboxes and killed the inhabitants with artillery-fired airbursts, the division as a whole was able to pierce the line and push into the German frontier. A 6-mile gap was torn in the German lines by the 4th ID in September 1944, only to be met by a counterattack by the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, which inflicted 800 casualties on the Ivy Division and forced them to retreat for the first time on the Western Front. The 4th Infantry would play a huge part in the Siegfried Line campaign, as would other infantry units, not the least of which were the 1st, 5th, and the 4th Armored, and many, many more. And when you look at Army history from World War II, the Siegfried Line campaign is a bit different than others. There wasn't much of an end to it. With most battles and campaigns, there's a definite beginning and end. Not so with the Westwall or Siegfried Line, whatever you want to call it. It seemed to never end. The Westwall was a place that would be prevalent in Army fighting until February, and even later in other locales. Towns and cities like Aachen, Manschau, the Ardennes, and a little idyllic Hansel and Gretel forest called the Hurtgen would all be along the fortifications of the Siegfried Line and would be a thorn in the American side until the spring of *45. Casualties from the campaign vary, and depending on which battles you lump into the campaign, like the Bulge for instance, can cause the casualty figures to soar, and the reason for that is because part of the Bulge was fought along the Siegfried Line. But when you look at just the campaign to knock out and fight through the bunker systems, the figures are still very high, extremely high. Estimated American casualties that relate to the piercing and destruction of the Siegfried Line range upwards near 140,000. Now that's not all killed, that is killed, wounded, and battle fatigue, But regardless of how you pile the numbers together, that is simply staggering. The Siegfried Line, Westwall, what have you, did not stop the Americans and their allies from penetrating the German frontier. But the defensive structures certainly made it infinitely harder than it ever should have been. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. Be sure to tune in next week when we discuss the 1969 film Bridge at Remagen. Until then, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on Stitcher and iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer Mallory Kirk, and our sound engineer Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.